She built an empire on fear. She buried her grief in blood. For 22 years, Seo Hye-Rin, the most feared woman in Seoul's underworld, believed her daughter was dead. Then a hungry stranger walked into the wrong restaurant, and something impossible cracked open inside a woman who had stopped believing in anything soft. If you've ever lost someone and never stopped carrying that loss, this story is for you. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't leave before the ending. You will not see it coming. The rain came without warning that October night, the way bad things always did in Seoul. Sideways and cold, cutting through wool and bone with the kind of indifference that felt almost personal. On the 14th floor of the Hansung Tower, Seo Hye-Rin sat alone at a window table and watched the city blur beneath her like a smear of light that couldn't decide what shape to hold. She was 51 years old. She had ordered the same thing she always ordered when she dined alone: black bean noodles, a glass of Bordeaux she barely touched, and silence. The restaurant staff knew not to hover. The security detail she never acknowledged waited near the elevator. Everyone in that room understood, without being told, that the woman at the corner table was not someone you approached unless you had been specifically invited to die. Seo Hye-Rin had not always looked like this. There were photographs buried in a drawer she hadn't opened in over a decade of a younger woman with loose hair and an unguarded mouth. A woman who laughed at terrible jokes. A woman who had once spent an entire Sunday morning lying on a blanket in Bukhansan with a man who smelled like cedar and motor oil, watching clouds shift overhead while a baby slept between them on a folded jacket. She did not look at those photographs anymore. She picked up her chopsticks, ate 3 bites of noodles, and set them down. Across the room, a sommelier was opening something expensive for a couple celebrating something she didn't care about. The restaurant hummed, crystal clinked. A jazz track drifted from a speaker mounted above the bar. Low, instrumental, utterly ignorable. Then the door opened. Hye-Rin didn't look up. Doors open constantly in restaurants, but something made her eyes move anyway. Some old instinct, still wired for threat even in rooms where the biggest danger was an overcooked wagyu. The young woman standing in the entrance was soaked through. Her jacket, thin, army surplus, at least 2 sizes too large, had gone dark with rain. Her hair was pulled back in a knot that had mostly come undone, and she was clutching a canvas bag against her ribs like it held everything she owned, which Hye-Rin would later learn it did. She was perhaps 22. She had a face that should have been beautiful, but was currently doing the hard work of pretending not to be embarrassed. She approached the host stand with her chin slightly lifted and asked, quietly, whether any of the tables had ordered food they hadn't finished, whether any of that food might be available. The host, a young man in a black vest whose sense of importance exceeded his salary, stared at her like she'd tracked mud across a museum floor. Which, technically, she had. She'd tracked rain. But his expression carried the specific contempt that certain people reserve for anyone who reminds them that the world isn't evenly divided. "This is a private dining establishment," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. The sentence did its damage the way a door does when it closes in someone's face. The young woman held his gaze for a moment. Her jaw moved just slightly. Not from anger, Hye-Rin thought, but from the effort of absorbing another ordinary humiliation without letting it knock her over. She nodded once, turned to leave. "Wait." Hye-Rin hadn't planned to say it. The word came out of somewhere below conscious thought, from whatever remains of a person after 22 years of deliberate hardening. It came out quiet, but it landed hard, because in that restaurant, her voice was the kind of voice rooms went still for. Everyone turned. The host turned. The security team near the elevator shifted their weight. The young woman turned. Hye-Rin looked at her for a long moment. From 40 feet away, across a room full of people who spent more on their shoes than this girl had eaten in weeks, she looked at a face she should have had no reason to recognize. "Bring her to my table," she said. The host opened his mouth. "Now," Hye-Rin said. He shut it. The girl walked across the restaurant with the posture of someone who had long ago decided that dignity was not something other people could take from you. She sat down across from Hye-Rin and didn't thank her immediately, which Hye-Rin noticed. Most people in that situation would have gushed, would have made themselves small and grateful and harmless. This girl just sat and waited and kept her bag on her lap. "What's your name?" Hye-Rin said. "Amara Ellis." "Ellis?" Hye-Rin said the word carefully, the way you say something when you're not sure if it's going to cut you. "That's not a Korean name. My father was American, Black American. I never met him." A pause. "I never met my mother either." Hye-Rin picked up the menu she hadn't needed to look at in years and slid it across the table. "Order whatever you want." Amara looked at the menu, then she looked at Hye-Rin. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can," Hye-Rin said, "and because nobody stopped that man from humiliating you, and they should have." Amara held her gaze. "You don't know me." "I know you're hungry." Hye-Rin signaled the waiter. "That's enough for now." What followed was strange and quiet and charged with something neither of them could have named. Amara ate, not frantically, not with the desperation Hye-Rin had expected, but steadily, with a kind of controlled attention that suggested she had learned to treat food as fuel rather than pleasure. She ate galbi jim and steamed rice, and a soup she didn't know the name of, and she asked about each dish before she tasted it, which was the kind of curiosity that didn't die easily in a person, no matter how hard life pressed down. They talked. Amara had spent 8 months without stable housing, moving between a church shelter that had closed and friends' floors that had run out of goodwill. Before that, she had been enrolled in education studies at a small university, working toward a teaching certification. Before that, an orphanage in Incheon. Her whole life had been a sequence of institutions that meant well and delivered inconsistently. "You want to teach?" Hye-Rin said. "Kids who get written off early," Amara said. "Because someone wrote me off early, and I got lucky with books. Not everybody does." Hye-Rin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had intensified. On the street below, a taxi hydroplaned slightly and recovered. The city kept moving, indifferent. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Hye-Rin asked. Amara looked at the table. "I'll figure it out," which meant nowhere. Hye-Rin had not made impulsive decisions in decades. Every action she took was calculated, mapped, pressure-tested against 17 contingencies before execution. She had built an empire on the refusal to be surprised. The fact that she was now opening her mouth to invite a stranger to her private residence was the kind of thing she would have found incomprehensible in anyone else. "You'll stay at my home tonight," she said. "One night. Clean clothes, a bed, a shower. In the morning you can go wherever you want." Amara studied her. "You don't do this with other people." "No." "Then why me?" Hye-Rin picked up her wine glass and looked at the dark liquid. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in years. The Baekryong estate occupied a private hillside in Seongbuk, behind walls that didn't announce themselves as walls. They presented as stone terracing, as garden architecture, as the kind of landscaping that said old money without spelling it out. The gate opened for Hye-Rin's car without anyone pressing anything. Inside, the house was warm and enormous and very quiet, the way houses are quiet when they've been holding a specific grief for a long time and have organized themselves around it. Amara walked in and didn't perform the expected reaction. She didn't gasp. She looked around carefully, the way someone looks at a place they're trying to understand, and she noticed things. The absence of family photographs on the main hall walls, the single orchid on the entry table that was slightly past its peak, the hallway that branched left toward what appeared to be a wing nobody used. A housekeeper named Mrs. Yoon showed her to a guest room. Clean towels, a change of clothes in approximately the right size. Amara stood in the bathroom for 20 minutes under hot water and tried not to think too loudly about the fact that she hadn't had this in 8 months. She came out and walked the corridor. She was not trying to snoop. She was restless, which was what happened to her body when she wasn't watching herself carefully. It moved, it explored, it refused to stay still. She'd been this way since childhood, always the orphanage kid who got caught in the kitchen at midnight, not stealing food, but reading the ingredient labels on cans because she'd run out of other things to read. The east corridor ended at a door. It was different from the other doors. Not locked with a key lock, locked with a deadbolt, a secondary chain, and something about the door frame suggested the wood around it had been sealed, as if whatever was inside had been made airtight against the rest of the house. Amara stood in front of it and felt something she couldn't explain, a pull she didn't have language for. She didn't touch it. She stood there for a moment, reading the absence of a nameplate where a nameplate might have gone, then walked back to her room. In the morning, she found Hye-Rin already awake at the kitchen table, holding a coffee cup with both hands, and staring out the window at the garden with the focused blankness of someone who had been awake since before it was light. Hye-Rin looked at her, and something passed across her face. Recognition and its opposite at the same time, something that contradicted itself inside a single expression. "You have a birthmark," Hye-Rin said. Not a question. She said it the way you say something you've already confirmed with your own eyes from across a room and are now forcing yourself to say aloud, because silence around it has become unbearable. Amara touched the spot behind her left ear automatically. Small, brown, homogeneous, crescent-shaped. She'd had it her whole life. "Yeah." Hye-Rin set down her cup. Her hands were not entirely steady. For a woman whose hands had signed orders that ended careers, and in certain cases, lives, this was remarkable. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to tell me the truth." "Okay." "The orphanage in Incheon. Do you know the name of it?" Amara frowned. "Hanbit Children's Home. Why?" Hye-Rin stood up slowly, as if her body required conscious negotiation with gravity. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to Amara, and her shoulders doing something they didn't usually do, holding too much, visibly, without the usual architecture of control keeping them level. "I had a daughter," she said. "She was born 22 years ago. She was sick when she was 6 months old. The doctors told me she died." A pause that lasted a long time. "I believed them. I buried—" She stopped. There was a burial, and I believed it. The kitchen was silent except for the refrigerator's low hum, and from somewhere outside, a bird that didn't know anything was wrong. Amara stood very still. "What are you saying?" Hye-Rin turned around. Her face was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. It was not in control of itself. "I'm saying I need to know, and I need you to not be frightened of what the answer might be." She crossed the room and stood in front of Amara and looked at her. The shape of her face, the angle of her eyes, the particular way her mouth held itself when she was thinking, the small crescent mark behind her ear that Hye-Rin had kissed approximately 100 times in the first 6 months of a life she thought was gone. Amara looked back at her. "You think I don't know what I think," Hye-Rin said. "That's why I need the truth." That afternoon, Hye-Rin made a phone call. One call, to a man named June Park, her most trusted investigator, a former intelligence analyst who had spent 20 years learning which rocks to lift and what to do about what he found underneath. She gave him 2 pieces of information, the name of the Hanbit Children's Home in Incheon and the arrival date of a mixed-race infant girl, approximately 6 months old, sometime in the first week of November, 22 years ago. "Find out where she came from," Hye-Rin said. "Find out who brought her." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. Amara had gone quiet. She sat in the garden with Hye-Rin's copy of a Korean history anthology she'd found on the shelf, holding the spine before she opened it, running her fingers down it first, which was a habit she'd had since the orphanage and had never bothered to explain to anyone because nobody had ever asked, and read without looking up. Hye-Rin watched her from the window. 22 years was a long time to carry a wound. Long enough that you stopped thinking of it as a wound and started thinking of it as architecture, as the reason certain rooms inside you were closed off, the reason certain words made your throat do things you refused to acknowledge, the reason you had built walls around a hillside estate and put a deadbolt on a room that still smelled, if you pressed your ear to the door on the right kind of night, faintly of talc and something sweet. She pressed nothing. She watched the girl in the garden turn a page. June Park called back in 18 hours. He had a name, Mina Rahi, 73 years old, retired. formerly a night shift nurse at Seoul Metropolitan Hospital's pediatric ward, on duty the November night 22 years ago when a baby girl admitted under the surname Kang had been declared deceased and quietly removed from the record. "She's alive?" Hye-Rin said. "Incheon, small apartment near the port. She hasn't talked to anyone about that night in 2 decades. A pause. "But she's been sending anonymous donations to the Hanbit Children's Home every year. Same amount. Same month. November." Hye-Rin was quiet. "You want me to bring her in?" June asked. "No," Hye-Rin said. "I'll go myself." She did not tell Amara where she was going. She told Mrs. Yoon to make sure the girl had everything she needed, and she got into her car in the gray morning and drove to Incheon with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind doing something it hadn't done since she was young. She was hoping, and she hated it. Hope was the most dangerous thing she knew, more dangerous than any rival syndicate or any debt unpaid, because hope didn't warn you before it took you apart. She found Mina Rhee in an apartment that smelled of instant rice and old newspapers, a woman with white hair and hands that shook slightly when she opened the door and saw who was standing on the other side. She knew who Hye-Rin was. She had always known this day would come. That was visible on her face immediately. The specific relief of someone who has been waiting for a consequence and finally sees it arriving. "I need to know what happened to my daughter," Hye-Rin said. Mina Rhee stepped back from the door. She didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, and besides, she was 73, and she had been carrying this for 22 years. And carrying things that long does something to a person. It makes them want, more than anything, to finally set them down. "Come in," she said. And in that small apartment in Incheon, with November rain beginning again outside, the old nurse sat down across from the most dangerous woman in Seoul and started talking. She talked for a long time, and what she said changed everything Hye-Rin thought she knew about the night her daughter died, because her daughter hadn't died. And the person who had made sure of that, the person who had arranged the false death certificate and paid for the silence and given the order that sent a 6-month-old girl to an orphanage under a name that wasn't hers, that person was not a stranger. That person was someone Hye-Rin saw at family dinners, someone who had stood beside her at the burial and held her arm while she wept, someone who, even now, sat on the inner council of the Baekryun Syndicate with a seat that Hye-Rin herself had given him. Mina Rhee said his name, and for the first time in 22 years, Seo Hye-Rin felt something crack open that wasn't grief. It was rage. Pure architectural load-bearing rage, the kind that doesn't burn hot and fast but settles into the foundation of a person and becomes structural, becomes the thing every subsequent action is built on top of. She stood up. She thanked Mina Rhee in a voice so controlled it frightened the old woman more than shouting would have. She walked to her car. She sat behind the wheel in the parking structure for 4 minutes and 40 seconds without starting the engine. Then she drove back to Seoul, back to the estate on the hill, back to a girl in a garden who was reading a book she'd held by the spine before opening it. The same way Hye-Rin's daughter had always held books, in the 6 months she was alive and present and real, back when the world still had warmth in it. There was a DNA test that needed to happen, and after that, after the confirmation she already knew was coming, already felt in her chest with a certainty that frightened her, there was a man named Kang Tae-wook who needed to learn what happened to people who stole from Seo Hye-Rin. But first, she had to walk back through that gate and look at a girl who might be her daughter, and not break apart before she had something solid to hand her. The gate opened. The car moved up the drive. In the garden, Amara Ellis looked up from her book, and neither of them knew yet what was already in motion, or who else was watching. The DNA kit arrived in a black case the size of a lunchbox, delivered by a man June Park trusted enough to use for things that couldn't be written down. No lab name on the packaging, no paperwork that would exist in any system. Hye-Rin had used this particular off-books geneticist twice before, once to confirm a rival's bloodline claim on a property dispute, once for something she didn't think about anymore. The results came back in 72 hours, and they were always accurate because the man who ran the lab understood that inaccuracy, in his line of work, had consequences that exceeded a bad Yelp review. Hye-Rin explained none of this to Amara. She sat across from her at the kitchen table the morning after Incheon and said, "I need you to do something for me. And I need you to trust me enough to do it before I explain why. Amara looked at her over a cup of tea she was holding with both hands. Outside, the garden was silver with early frost. She had slept 12 hours and still looked tired in the way that 8 months of bad sleep makes you tired. Structurally, in the bones, not the kind that one good night fixes. That's a lot to ask someone you met 3 days ago, Amara said. Yes, Hye-Rin said. It is. A pause. Amara set down the cup. What do you need? Hye-Rin slid the swab kit across the table. Amara looked at it, then at Hye-Rin. Something moved behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but the particular alertness of someone whose life has delivered enough sudden reversals that they've learned to read rooms carefully before moving through them. DNA, Amara said. Yes. You think we're related? Hye-Rin held her gaze and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Amara picked up the swab kit. She turned it over in her hands. Her jaw was doing the same thing it had done in the restaurant. That small, contained movement of someone processing something large through a narrow opening. She tore the packaging open, ran the swab, sealed it, and slid it back across the table in one motion. She didn't ask what would happen if the test came back positive. She didn't ask what Hye-Rin wanted from her if it did. She just sat back and picked up her tea again and looked out at the frost-covered garden. And Hye-Rin had the strangest sensation that this girl had been waiting for something her whole life without knowing what it was, and was now being careful not to want it too loudly. June Park took the sample without asking questions. That was what Hye-Rin paid him for. The 72 hours that followed were the longest Hye-Rin had spent inside her own head in 20 years. She ran the syndicate during the day. Calls, meetings, a property negotiation in Mapo that required her physical presence and her most controlled face. And at night she sat in the dark of her study with a glass of wine she didn't drink and listened to the house breathe around her. Amara moved through the estate with a carefulness that wasn't timidity. She read. She helped Mrs. Yoon in the kitchen without being asked, which surprised the housekeeper enough that she mentioned it twice. She walked the garden in the cold without a heavier coat than she needed, as if her body was accustomed to discomfort and didn't know how to fully accept warmth yet. On the second night, Hye-Rin walked the east corridor at 2 a.m. and found Amara standing in front of the sealed door again. She wasn't touching it. She was just standing there in the half-dark with her arms folded across her chest and her head slightly tilted, the way a person stands when they're listening to something that isn't sound. You keep coming back to this door, Hye-Rin said. Amara turned around. She didn't startle. I know, I don't know why. She looked back at it. What's in there? Hye-Rin stood beside her and looked at the door she hadn't opened in 11 years. The deadbolt, the chain, the sealed frame. All of it installed in a single afternoon after she'd walked out of that room for the last time and decided that closing it was the only thing standing between her and a grief that would dismantle her completely if she let it get air. My daughter's room, she said. Amara was quiet for a moment. The one who died. Yes. Another silence. Then Amara said very carefully, what was her name? Sora. The name came out differently than Hye-Rin expected. She had said it in her own head 10,000 times over 22 years, but saying it aloud to another person in a corridor at 2 a.m. made it land in her chest like something physical. Sora Kang Ellis. The air in the corridor changed. Amara turned her head slowly and looked at Hye-Rin with an expression that was not quite shock. It was the expression of someone hearing a sound they recognize from somewhere they can't immediately place, something that reverberates in a frequency below conscious thought. Ellis, she said. Her father's name, Hye-Rin said. Marcus Ellis. Amara's hands unfolded from her chest. She pressed one of them flat against the wall beside the door, not the door itself, just the wall next to it, and stood there breathing. Her exhale was audible. You said American, Black American. Yes. My father. She stopped, started again. The orphanage told me my father was an American man, African American. They didn't have a name for him. They said the records were incomplete. She was looking at the door now, not at Hye-Rin. They said my mother was Korean. that she was young, that she couldn't keep me. You were not given up, Hye-Rin said. Her voice was very flat. Not cold, controlled, the way you control something that would otherwise be uncontrollable. You were taken. Amara turned and looked at her fully. Someone took my daughter from me, Hye-Rin said, and I am going to prove it. But I needed to tell you that before the results come back, because whatever that test says, you were not abandoned. Someone made a choice that was not mine, and I have spent 22 years not knowing who to be angry at, and I am very angry, and I need you to know that none of that anger is directed at you. Amara stared at her. Then she said, Who took her? I don't have proof yet, Hye-Rin said. Soon. Amara nodded once, slowly. She looked at the door one more time. Then she turned and walked back to her room, and Hye-Rin stood alone in the corridor with her hand on the wall beside the sealed frame, not opening it, not yet, because some things you only open once and you need to be ready for what comes out. The results arrived on a Thursday morning. June Park drove them himself. He walked into the kitchen, set a sealed envelope on the table, and looked at Hye-Rin with the face of a man who already knew what was inside because he was good enough at his job to have run preliminary verification before he came, and who was now recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the last 22 years. The probability, he said, is 99.998%. Hye-Rin picked up the envelope. She did not open it immediately. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was nothing, paper and data, lighter than a single day of the grief she'd been carrying, and breathed. Amara was in the garden. Hye-Rin walked outside. The frost had lifted, but the air was still cold enough to see her breath. Amara was sitting on the stone bench near the bare persimmon tree with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when she heard the door. Hye-Rin sat down beside her. She set the envelope between them on the bench. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It's positive, Amara said. Not a question. 99.998%, Hye-Rin said. Amara looked down at the envelope. A long silence. Then, from somewhere inside her, not a sound she performed, not something built for anyone's consumption, a breath that was almost a sound, almost a word, something that had been held for 22 years in the body of a woman who had grown up being told nobody wanted her, and was now sitting next to the mathematical proof that someone had. She pressed both hands against her face. Hye-Rin sat with her. She did not reach out immediately because she understood instinctively that this particular grief needed to be touched carefully, that you don't grab a person who has been bracing against the world for 2 decades. You wait until they decide where the walls are going to come down. After a while, Amara lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. She did not apologize for it. I need to know everything, she said. All of it. Who took me? Why? I need to know. You will, Hye-Rin said. All of it. She meant it. What she didn't say was that knowing everything was going to cost something. That the name Mina Ri had given her in that Incheon apartment, Kang Tae-wook, belonged to a man who currently controlled the Baek Ryon Syndicate's Eastern operations, who sat 3 seats to her left at the inner council table, who had attended the false burial of a child he'd had removed and stood beside her while she wept and said the things people say at gravesides. She had given him that seat. She had trusted him with the infrastructure of everything she'd built, and he had used the access she gave him to sit on the knowledge of what he'd done for 22 years, secure in the certainty that dead daughters don't come back. Except this one had. June Park brought Mina Ri to the estate that afternoon. The old nurse sat in the formal sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and told her story again, this time with Amara present. Amara sat across from her and listened with a stillness that was more unnerving than anger would have been. The particular stillness of someone hearing the story of their own theft for the first time, from the mouth of the person who had been paid to make them disappear. Mina spoke carefully. She described the night, the pediatric ward, the baby who had been improving, who the doctors expected to recover from the fever, who was going to be fine. She described the phone call she received on her personal number from a voice she recognized. Kang Tae-wook, who was then a rising figure in the Kang family organization, who told her what he needed and what he would pay, and what would happen to her own family if she refused. "I couldn't kill a baby," Mina said. Her voice was thin and steady at the same time. "I couldn't do it, but I couldn't say no to him either, so I did the only thing I could think of. I took her out of the hospital. I drove to Incheon. I put her in a basket outside the Hanbiet home at 4 in the morning, and I rang the bell, and I walked away." She stopped. "I've been walking away from that night for 22 years. Amara looked at the old woman for a long time. "You saved my life." "I let someone else save it," Mina said. "There's a difference." "Not to me," Amara said. Something shifted in Mina Ree's face. Not relief. It was too late for clean relief, but the slight easing of a weight. Hye-Rin sat in the corner and watched them and thought about Kang Tae-wook's face at the council table last Tuesday, the way he'd poured her tea, the way he'd agreed with her position on the Mapo property as if he were her most loyal advisor, as if he were simply a man who respected her leadership and had never done anything to earn the specific kind of destruction she was now planning. That evening, Hye-Rin called a restricted contact within the Seoul Metropolitan Police, not a favor she used lightly. She arranged for Mina Ree's formal statement to be recorded under protected witness conditions, off the official books for now, sealed until she decided what to do with it. She was not yet ready to move on Tae-wook. Moving on Tae-wook without the right architecture was the kind of mistake you made once. He had allies in the council. He had informants in her outer security ring. She suspected it, had suspected it for years, filed it under things to address when she had time. She hadn't had time. She did now. "What are you going to do?" Amara asked her that night. They were in the study, the fire going, the house quiet around them. "Dismantle him," Hye-Rin said, "carefully." "How long does carefully take?" "As long as it has to." Amara looked at the fire. She had changed in the last 48 hours in ways that were subtle and total at once. The way a landscape changes when the weather shifts. Same terrain, different light. The girl who had stood in the restaurant doorway, soaked through and trying not to show humiliation, was still present in her, but now there was something else underneath, something with structure. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said. Hye-Rin looked at her. "I didn't end up on the street because I was unlucky," Amara said. She was staring at the fire and her jaw was doing the thing again. "There was a man at the university. His name was Darius Cole. He approached me in my second year, told me he was an investment consultant, said he was working on an educational technology startup and looking for partners who understood pedagogy from the inside." She paused. "He was good at it, the pitch. He had documents, an office. Everything looked real." "What did he want from you?" "Signatures," Amara said. "I was the educational component," he said. "My name gave the company credibility with grant bodies. I co-signed funding applications, business registration documents, a loan agreement." She stopped. "I didn't understand what I was signing. I was 20. I didn't know." Her voice didn't break, but it tightened. That specific tightening that happens when anger and shame occupy the same sentence. "He disappeared 3 months later. The business was fake. The loans were real. The debt came back to me because my name was on everything." Hye-Rin was very still. "How much?" she said. "About 40 million won. By the time the interest compounded." Amara stopped. "It doesn't matter. I couldn't pay it. I lost my scholarship, lost my apartment, started couch surfing. Then the debt collectors started, and I couldn't stay anywhere with someone else's address because I didn't want to put people at risk." She finally looked at Hye-Rin. "I've been on the street for 8 months because a man I trusted decided I was useful." The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the persimmon tree. "Darius Cole," Hye-Rin said, flat, memorizing it. "He's gone. I don't know where." "I'll find him," Hye-Rin said. Amara shook her head slightly. "I'm not telling you this so you can—" "I know why you're telling me," Hye-Rin said. "And I'm telling you I'll find him. Not for revenge, for closure, for documentation. Because what he did was fraud and you deserve to have your name off of documents you were manipulated into signing." Amara held her gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. June Park had Darius Cole's last known location within 36 hours. He'd left Seoul. He was operating out of Busan. Different name, same methodology. Approaching younger students, the same pitch about educational consulting, the same manufactured legitimacy. A pattern. June ran the pattern back, and what he found made Hye-Rin's hand tighten on the phone until her knuckles went white. Darius Cole had come to Seoul University on a referral. The referral could be traced through 2 shell layers and a defunct consulting firm back to a private account. The account's beneficial owner, once you stripped the corporate structuring away, was a man who lived in a neighborhood in Seongbuk, who attended inter-council meetings, who poured Hye-Rin's tea on Tuesdays. Kang Tae-wook hadn't just stolen her daughter 22 years ago. He had found her again. Found Amara specifically, tracked her to the university somehow. Perhaps through old orphanage records, perhaps through informants in places Hye-Rin hadn't thought to look. And he had sent a man to ruin her before she could become anything Hye-Rin might recognize. He had tried to destroy Amara twice, and he had no idea that the woman sitting in Hye-Rin's study by the fire was still breathing, still intact enough to tell the story, or that Hye-Rin now held both ends of the rope that would hang him. She sat with this information for 40 minutes. Then she made a decision that couldn't be unmade. She called a number she used only for the kind of business that didn't happen in meeting rooms. She gave 3 instructions. The first 2 were operational: moving certain financial records into protected positions, adjusting the security detail around the estate without explaining why. The third instruction was a name. She told her contact to pull everything they had on Kang Tae-wook's current financial exposure, his private communications over the last 6 months, and specifically any contact with a man named Darius Cole. She was building a case. Not for a courtroom, for a reckoning. What she didn't know, and wouldn't know until it was almost too late, was that Tae-wook had his own source inside her operation. Someone who had noticed the DNA kit. Someone who had flagged the Incheon trip. Someone who had watched Amara Ellis move from a restaurant doorway into the Baekryong estate and understood immediately what that meant for Kang Tae-wook's carefully constructed 22 years of security. And while Hye-Rin was building her case, Tae-wook was already building his. He met Darius Cole in a private room above a Busan restaurant on a Thursday night, and the document he slid across the table was not a financial instrument or a business proposal. It was a story. Crafted, detailed, internally consistent. A story in which a young woman named Amara Ellis had spent months researching Seo Hye-Rin before the restaurant encounter, in which she had identified the birthmark from old family photographs circulated in private social networks, in which the goal from the beginning had been access to the Baekryong fortune, and the hunger and the homelessness and the tears in the garden had all been performance. Darius Cole read it and looked up. "You want me to be a witness?" "I want you to be a witness," Tae-wook said. "I want 2 others. I have them. I want forged communication records showing she researched Hye-Rin 6 months before the restaurant. I have those too." He folded his hands on the table. "I want this delivered to Hye-Rin in a format she cannot dismiss." "And if she investigates?" "She'll find what I've put there to find," Tae-wook said. "She's good, but she's also a mother who has just found a daughter she thought was dead for 22 years. And hope makes even the sharpest people stupid." Darius Cole picked up the document. He thought about the 40 million won in fraud he'd run through Amara's name, and the fact that if Amara was now under Hye-Rin's protection, that entire operation was a liability he needed to bury. He thought about what Tae-wook was offering him in exchange for the testimony, clearance, relocation, a new identity in a country where his previous methodology could start fresh. He picked up the pen. In Seoul, in the study of the Baekryong estate, Amara Ellis sat by a dying fire and held a cup of cold tea and thought about the sealed door at the end of the east corridor. She thought about a woman who had cried at a graveside for a child who wasn't there. She thought about what it meant to be wanted, not as an heir, not as a symbol, not as proof of anything, but simply as the person you were, with the life you'd actually lived, with all the damage it had done to you. She thought about how badly she wanted to believe that this was real, and how much harder that made it to trust it. The fire went out. She sat in the dark for a while, not moving, listening to the house, and somewhere in the east wing, behind a sealed door, the past was waiting for someone to let it out. It didn't have to wait much longer. The envelope arrived on a Monday. Not through June Park, not through any channel Hye-Rin controlled or recognized. It was hand-delivered to the estate's secondary gate at 6:47 in the morning by a courier whose face the security cameras caught cleanly. Young man, dark jacket, no agency markings, who left it with the gate guard and walked back to a car, with plates that June would later trace to a rental agency in Gangnam, paid for in cash under a name that didn't exist. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a single sheet of paper. The paper said, "Before you go further, watch this. You owe yourself the truth. No signature." Hye-Rin stood at her desk and looked at the drive in her palm for a long moment. It was small, black, ordinary. The kind of thing that could hold anything. Contracts, photographs, nothing. Everything. She was not a woman who plugged unverified drives into her systems without sweeping them first, and she didn't now. She handed it to her tech contact, a woman named Sarah who ran signals intelligence for the syndicate's inner operations, and told her to image it, sandbox it, and tell her what was on it within 2 hours. Sarah called back in 90 minutes. "It's clean," she said. "No malware, no trackers. It's video files, 3 of them." "Send them to my isolated terminal," Hye-Rin said. She watched them alone. The first video was surveillance footage, grainy, time-stamped, shot from what appeared to be a fixed camera inside a university library. The date in the corner was 14 months ago. The footage showed a young woman at a study carrel with a laptop open, and the camera angle was oblique enough that you couldn't read the screen directly. But Sarah had run enhancement, and in the enhanced still frames she had attached to her message, you could see fragments of the search terms on the laptop screen. The name Seo Hye-Rin was visible in 3 separate frames. The name betrayal syndicate in one. The phrase missing heir birthmark in another. The young woman in the footage had her hair pulled back in a knot. Her jacket was army surplus. Hye-Rin sat with the first video for a long time before she opened the second. The second was a recorded phone call, audio only, with a transcription document attached. The call was between 2 voices. A man whose voice Sarah had flagged as unidentified, and a young woman. The conversation was about money, about access, about a woman in Seoul who had lost a child 22 years ago and had never recovered from it, and whose blind spot was grief, if you knew how to aim at it correctly. The young woman's voice on the call said, "I can do this. I know what she needs to see. I've studied her for months." The third video was the most damaging. It was shot on a phone, handheld, in what appeared to be a cheap apartment. Bare walls, a mattress on the floor, a takeout container on a windowsill. Darius Cole sat in frame, looking directly at the camera with the composed affect of someone who has rehearsed this. He gave his name. He gave a date. He said that he had been contacted 8 months ago by a young woman named Amara Ellis, who had found him through a mutual contact in Busan. He said that she had hired him to construct a false financial fraud scenario that she could use as a backstory, something that would explain homelessness, explain vulnerability, make her appear victimized in a way that would resonate with a specific emotional profile. He said he had been paid for this in 3 installments. He said the woman he was describing had known exactly who Seo Hye-Rin was, had known about the lost daughter, had known about the birthmark, and had orchestrated the restaurant encounter specifically to exploit a mother's grief. He said it cleanly, without hesitation, looking straight into the camera. Hye-Rin closed the terminal. She sat in her chair for 4 minutes and 20 seconds and did not move. Then she stood up and walked out of the study and down the east corridor and stopped in front of the sealed door. She put one hand flat against the wood. She could feel her own pulse in her palm. She stood there breathing, slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing you do when the alternative is something you can't take back. And then she turned and walked to the kitchen where Amara was eating toast and reading a worn paperback she'd found on the 3rd shelf of the sitting room bookcase. Amara looked up. She saw Hye-Rin's face and the toast stopped halfway to her mouth. "What happened?" she said. Hye-Rin pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She set the USB drive on the table between them. She looked at Amara. At the face she had spent 72 hours allowing herself to recognize. The face she had let herself map against memory with a tenderness she had not permitted herself in 22 years. And she said, "Did you know who I was before the restaurant?" The air in the kitchen changed. Amara set the toast down. "What?" "Before that night," Hye-Rin said. Before you walked in, soaked through, and asked about the leftover food. Did you know who I was? Did you know I had a daughter? Did you know about the birthmark? Amara was looking at the drive. Her face had gone still in the way faces go still before they break or harden, and Hye-Rin couldn't yet tell which direction it would go. Where did that come from? Delivered this morning, 3 videos, library surveillance, a phone call recording, a man named Darius Cole giving a statement on camera. Hye-Rin's voice was level, controlled. Every word cost something, but she spent them evenly. In the recording, a woman's voice says she studied me for months. In the surveillance footage, your jacket is visible and a search for my name is on the screen. In Cole's testimony, he says you hired him to manufacture the fraud story, to manufacture the backstory. She stopped. Tell me it's fabricated. Amara's jaw was tight. It's fabricated. Tell me how. I don't know how. I don't know where that footage came from. I've never hired anyone for anything. I don't know that recording. The voice on the recording sounds like you. Amara went very still. What? It's processed, Hye-Rin said. Slightly. Enough that a basic analysis can't confirm it definitively. But the cadence, the phrasing, Sarah flagged it as a possible match. For a moment, Amara didn't speak. Then something happened on her face that Hye-Rin had not expected. Not the defensive anger of someone caught, not the performance of wounded innocence, but a specific exhausted recognition, the look of someone watching a pattern they know from years of experience complete itself. Someone built this, Amara said. Someone built this specifically for you to find. That's one explanation. That's the only explanation. Amara pushed her chair back and stood up because sitting still had become impossible. She moved to the window and stood with her back to Hye-Rin and both hands on the counter's edge. And Hye-Rin could see her shoulders working, see the effort of staying inside her own skin. I was on the street for 8 months. I didn't have a phone half that time. I didn't have a laptop. I was asking for leftover food in restaurants. You think I was running a calculated long game to infiltrate a mafia dynasty while sleeping in doorways? I think that's what the footage and the recording and the testimony suggest. Amara turned around. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steady. Do you believe them? The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. I don't know what I believe, Hye-Rin said. Which was the truth? Which was the problem? Amara looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the USB drive on the table. Then she looked at the door that led to the hallway that led to the east corridor and the sealed room, and everything Hye-Rin had started to allow herself to hope. Then I should go, Amara said. Sit down. No, not angry, not performing anything, just a word with a wall behind it. If you don't know what you believe, I can't stay here. I've spent my whole life in places where people weren't sure about me. I know what it feels like to be tolerated. I'm not doing it again. She was already moving toward the hallway. I'll get my things. Amara. She stopped, didn't turn around. The DNA test is real, Hye-Rin said. I know, Amara said. That's the part that makes this hurt. She went to the guest room. Hye-Rin sat in the kitchen and did not follow her. She sat with the USB drive and the toast and the open paperback and the cup of tea that was going cold, and she ran the footage in her head again. The library, the jacket, the search terms. And she ran the recording. The voice that sounded like Amara's voice, the specific cadence of it. And then she ran Amara's face at the restaurant door, the way her chin had been slightly up, the way she hadn't gushed or performed gratitude, the way she'd asked, "Why are you doing this?" before she said thank you. And she ran Amara's face in the garden when the results came back, the breath that wasn't performed, the tears that had come from somewhere real, and she ran Amara's hand flat against the wall beside the sealed door at 2 a.m. She ran all of it, and the math didn't hold together, not completely. Something was off by a degree she couldn't locate. Hye-Rin called June Park. The drive, she said. I need the courier traced completely, not just the car, the person who paid for the car, the person who contacted that person, all the way back. Already started, June said. There's something else. Say it. The library and the surveillance footage. I ran the timestamp against the university's public access records. A pause. That Carol wasn't in use on that date. The timestamp is wrong. Not wrong by accident, wrong by design, but whoever altered it made a small error in the metadata encoding. The original timestamp shows the footage is from 16 months ago. Hye-Rin was silent. 16 months ago, June continued, Amar Ellis was documented at the Incheon Municipal Shelter. They have her intake record, her photograph, her fingerprints. She was there for 3 weeks. The university library is in Seoul. They're 2 hours apart, and she had no documented travel during that period. Another pause. She couldn't have been in both places. The recording, Hye-Rin said. Voice synthesis, June said. It's getting good enough to fool basic analysis. Sarah ran a deeper pass after I asked her to look for artifacts. There are compression patterns in the vocal tract that don't occur in natural recordings. It was built from samples, probably scraped from public sources. Interviews, maybe, video comments, anything with her voice. Hye-Rin closed her eyes. And Cole. Cole was in Busan when he recorded that testimony. I have him on a traffic camera 2 blocks from the restaurant where we know Tae-wook has a standing private arrangement. June's voice was careful now, the way it got when he was moving around something that had weight. He didn't do this for a stranger, Hye-Rin. He did this for someone who could protect him from what he already knew was coming. The kitchen was very quiet. How long do I have before Tae-wook knows the drive didn't work, she said. If he has someone inside watching your reactions? Hours. Maybe less. She opened her eyes. Find her, she said. She left 10 minutes ago on foot. She doesn't have a phone. Find her before she gets to a transit station. She hung up and stood, and for a moment she pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and just breathed. One breath, too, the specific controlled breathing of a woman who has built an empire on never being reactive, who is now facing the particular terror of how close she came to throwing away the only thing that mattered, because someone had aimed a fabrication at exactly the right wound. She had spent 22 years hardening that wound into architecture. She had forgotten that scars aren't the same as armor. June's team found Amara 4 blocks from the estate, walking south on a road with no sidewalk, her canvas bag over one shoulder, her army surplus jacket pulled tight against air that was dropping toward freezing. She didn't run when the car pulled alongside her. She stopped and looked at the window when it rolled down and June leaned across. She wants you to come back, he said. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Does she know what she believes yet? Yes, June said. Another moment. Then Amara got in. When she walked back through the kitchen door, Hye-Rin was standing at the table with the USB drive in one hand. She set it down when Amara came in, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the space. 2 women, 22 years of distance between them, a fabrication that had almost done what a fake death certificate had done before it. The footage is manipulated, Hye-Rin said. The recording is synthesized. Cole recorded that testimony in the same neighborhood where Kang Tae-wook keeps a private room. You were in Incheon on the date the library footage claims to show you in Seoul. Amara said nothing. I should not have needed to verify, Hye-Rin said. I should have known. You've been surviving on distrust for 20 years, Amara said. That doesn't go away because you want it to. No, Hye-Rin said, but I should have started with you, not with the evidence. She looked at Amara directly. I'm sorry. Amara absorbed this. It took a moment. She wasn't built to receive apologies easily, which made sense, given that the people in her life who should have apologized to her most had never had the chance or the inclination. She nodded once, slowly, and something between them settled back into place, not the same as before, sturdier. He knows the drive didn't land, Amar said. Yes. So what does he do next? Hye-Rin sat down. He escalates. He can't let this sit. If I know it's him and he knows I know, waiting is the same as losing. He'll move on the council before I can. He'll try to take my position from below before I can remove him from above. She looked at the drive. He'll also try to come at you directly. Now that the reputational play failed, he'll look for something that can't be disproven with metadata. Amara sat down across from her. Something physical. Or legal, Hye-Rin said. A warrant. Fraud charges tied to the debt Cole manufactured. It's already documented under your name. If he has a contact in the prosecutor's office, and I have to assume he does, He could have you detained within 48 hours. Amara looked at the table. She was doing the math. Hye-Rin could see it. Running the angles, tracing the exits, the way someone thinks who has spent years navigating situations that didn't offer good options. Then we have 48 hours. Less, Hye-Rin said. He'll know the drive failed by tonight. Then we start now, Amara said. What do we have? Hye-Rin looked at her daughter. The words still felt new in her chest, sharp-edged, real. And she thought about the 18 hours that stood between them and Tae-wook making a move she couldn't counter without showing her hand prematurely. She thought about Mina Ri's statement, sealed and protected. She thought about the financial thread June had traced back through the shell companies to Tae-wook's account. She thought about the one thing she hadn't pulled yet because she hadn't been ready to confirm what it might mean. The communication records between Tae-wook and Cole over the last 8 months, which her contact had compiled but which she hadn't opened because she'd been building toward it carefully, step by step. The way you approach a structure you're planning to demolish, you take the time to understand the load-bearing elements before you pull anything out. She was out of time for careful. She called her contact and told him to send the communication records immediately. They came through in 20 minutes. 6 months of encrypted messages between a number registered to a shell company and a number in Busan, decoded by a system she didn't ask about. She and Amara sat at the desk in the study and went through them together, Hye-Rin reading aloud in English and Amara flagging the significant passages on a notepad. The records were comprehensive in the way that damned people who believed their encryption was better than it was. Tae-wook had communicated with Cole not just about the Amara operation, but about the original one. 22 years ago, there were references, oblique but traceable to the right reader. The nurse, the hospital arrangement, the Enshin solution. He had kept a record of it, not out of sentiment, out of leverage. In case Mina Ri ever became a problem, in case anyone ever came looking. He had kept it in a system he believed was secure, and now it was on Hye-Rin's desk. This is enough, Amara said. She was looking at the printout, at the decoded message thread. This plus Mina's statement, plus the financial trace. This is enough. For a prosecutor, yes, Hye-Rin said. Amara looked at her. But a prosecutor takes time. A prosecutor requires a process. And in the time between now and when a formal case can be built, Tae-wook has access to my counsel, my financial infrastructure, my outer security personnel. He has a mole somewhere in my operation, someone who told him about the DNA test, about Incheon, about you. Someone who is currently in this building or close enough to it to have eyes on my movements. She set the printout down. Before I can move on him through official channels, I need to know who that is. Because if I don't, anything I file, anything I prepare, anything I hand to a prosecutor gets back to him before it lands. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How do you find a mole? You feed them something, Hye-Rin said. Something specific enough to be traced back if it moves. Something that looks like an operational detail, but is actually a marker. She looked at Amara. You make them think they have something valuable, and you watch where it goes. What's the bait? Hye-Rin thought for a moment. Then she said, You. Amara's expression didn't change. Explain. I let it be known, through 3 separate internal channels, that you are being moved to a safe house location tomorrow morning. Different location in each channel. Whichever location Tae-wook acts on tells me which channel is compromised and who had access to it. Amar considered this. And if he moves on the safe house before you've identified the mole? Then we adapt, Hye-Rin said. But I have people I trust completely at each location. You won't be in actual danger. You trust completely, Amar said. That's what you thought about Tae-wook. The sentence landed exactly where it was aimed. Hye-Rin held her gaze. Yes, she said. It is. She didn't look away. I'm asking you to trust me anyway. Amara looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across her face. The same calculation she'd been running since the kitchen. The same fundamental question of whether this particular person, in this particular situation, was worth the risk of being wrong about. She had been wrong before. She had been wrong about Darius Cole in a way that cost her everything she'd built. She had spent 8 months on the street as the direct consequence of misplaced trust. and she was sitting here now being asked to be bait. "Okay," she said. The plan ran through the night. 3 channels, 3 locations, 3 carefully worded pieces of information passed through the appropriate personnel at appropriate times, each slightly different, each with a specific marker embedded in the address or the timing or the vehicle description that would identify its source. By 4 in the morning, Hye-Rin had her answer. One of the 3 channels had moved. The information had passed through a single person, a man named Cho Byung-soo, 11 years in her operation, head of the Northern Logistics Division, a man she had promoted twice. The marker was in the vehicle description, a white sedan with a specific plate prefix that Hye-Rin had fabricated. At 3:47 in the morning, a car matching that description was dispatched to the first location's address, carrying 2 men whose professional silhouette was unmistakable. Cho Byung-soo was brought in before dawn. He didn't deny it when Hye-Rin walked into the room. He had the look of a man who had been running a calculation for a long time and had finally arrived at the number. He sat in the chair and looked at his hands, and when Hye-Rin asked him how long, he said 5 years. 5 years. "What did he have on you?" Hye-Rin said. Cho was quiet for a moment, then, "My brother." Tae-wook arranged the debt. The business loan that went bad. He owns it. He told me 5 years ago that the debt disappears if I keep him informed, that it comes due in full the day I stop. Hye-Rin stood in front of him and thought about what Tae-wook had done to Amara. The same mechanism, the same architecture, the weaponization of financial vulnerability to manufacture loyalty and silence. He had been running this playbook for decades. She was probably not looking at the only person he'd caught in it. "Your brother's debt is cleared as of tonight," she said. "I'll handle it directly." Cho looked up. "In exchange," she said, "you're going to help me finish this." She told him what she needed. It was simple, precise, and required Cho to make 1 phone call to Tae-wook the following morning. A call that would tell him that Hye-Rin was moving to consolidate, that she was planning to call an emergency council session to formally request his removal based on evidence she intended to present, that she was moving fast and he had perhaps 24 hours before the council vote. It was a lie. There was no council vote. But Tae-wook, hearing that his window was closing, would do what cornered men always did when they had spent 22 years building a position on a secret that was about to become public. He would come to her directly. He would try to deal. And when he did, Hye-Rin would be ready, with everything recorded, with Jun's team in position, with the communication records and Minari's statement and the financial trace and the fabricated evidence he'd sent on a USB drive all laid out where the right people could see them. She looked at Cho. "Can you do that?" He nodded. She walked out of the room and into the corridor and stopped, and for a moment she put her hand against the wall, not the sealed door, just the wall, and stood there breathing. The house was quiet. Outside, the first light was starting somewhere beyond the hills, that specific gray that doesn't commit to dawn yet. From down the hall, the guest room door was open. Amara was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the canvas bag in her lap the way she had in the restaurant. As if it still held everything she owned and the habit of protecting it hadn't caught up with the fact that her circumstances had changed. She looked at Hye-Rin in the doorway. "It worked?" she said. "It worked," Hye-Rin said. "Cho Byung-soo, 11 years. Tae-wook had his brother." Amara absorbed this. "Are you surprised?" Hye-Rin thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "That's the worst part." They looked at each other across the room. "Tomorrow," Hye-Rin said, "this ends, one way or another." Amara set the canvas bag down on the bed beside her. She didn't put it down the way you put down something you're finished with. She put it down the way you put down something you're choosing to leave, at least for now, because your hands need to be free for what comes next. "Then we should sleep," she said. Outside, the gray light was becoming something definite, and in a private room above a Busan restaurant, Kang Tae-wook received a phone call from a man named Cho and listened and set down his glass and understood that the reckoning he had built 22 years of his life around avoiding was now standing at the door. What he didn't understand yet was that the woman who had opened it was not coming alone. Cho Byung-soo made the call at 8:15 in the morning. Hye-Rin listened from the adjacent room through a feed Sarah had set up on a clean line. Not recording, not yet, because the recording she needed would happen later in person when Tae-wook was in the room and didn't know it. She listened to Cho's voice stay steady through the entire call, which she respected. The man had spent 5 years living inside a betrayal not of his own choosing, carrying it the way you carry something that has grown into your body. Not comfortably, but with the specific adaptation of something that has no other option. Tae-wook's voice on the other end was controlled, unhurried. The voice of a man who had been managing crises for decades and had developed a metabolism for threat that processed it quietly without visible spike. He asked 2 questions. He said he would come to Seoul tonight. He said to tell Hye-Rin he wanted to speak with her privately before any council session was called. He hung up. Cho sat in the chair across from the feed equipment and looked at Hye-Rin through the open door. He was sweating lightly at the temples. She nodded once at him, and he exhaled. The rest of the day moved with the specific quality of time before something irreversible. Slow in the body, fast in the mind, every ordinary detail too sharp and too present. Hye-Rin ate breakfast she didn't taste. She walked the estate twice, checking positions, confirming with Jun's team where each person was and what they were watching. She had 4 of her most trusted people inside the building and 3 in the perimeter. She had Sarah running communications intercepts on Tae-wook's known numbers. She had the communication records, Mina Ree's statement, the financial trace, and the fabricated USB evidence all compiled in a single encrypted file that existed in 2 locations, one on her isolated terminal and one with a lawyer in a sealed envelope with instructions that it be opened in the event she couldn't open it herself. That last part she did not mention to Amara. Amara spent the morning at the kitchen table. She had found a legal pad in the study, and she was writing, longhand, fast, filling pages with what appeared to be notes, but which, when Hye-Rin glanced at them, turned out to be a timeline. Amara was building her own documentation of everything, dates, names, connections, the sequence of what had been done to her and when. Her handwriting was small and dense, and she wrote without pausing to reconsider, the way someone writes when they're finally allowed to say something they've been holding for a long time. Hye-Rin watched her for a moment from the doorway. "You don't have to do that today." "I know," Amara said, without looking up. "I want to." Hye-Rin left her to it. At 2 in the afternoon, Sarah flagged movement. Tae-wook had left his Seongbuk residence. His car was heading into the city. He was not alone. 2 vehicles behind him, both carrying people whose professional posture, caught by traffic cameras Sarah was watching, indicated they were not personal assistants. "He's coming early," Jun said over the phone. 3 hours early. "He wants to see the house before he's expected," Hye-Rin said. "He wants to know the configuration." "Do you want to change the plan?" "No." She was already moving down the corridor. "Accelerate it. I want everyone in position in 20 minutes. She went to the kitchen. Amara looked up from the legal pad and read her face immediately. "He's coming now," Amara said. "Earlier than expected. You need to go to the East Wing and stay there. Mrs. Yoon will be with you. Do not come out for any reason until June comes for you personally." Amara stood up. "I should be in the room." "No. He did this to me. I should—" "You're not a weapon," Hye-Rin said. "You're evidence. The most important evidence I have is you standing intact at the end of this. So you go to the East Wing, and you stay there, and you let me do what I know how to do." She looked at her daughter, held the eye contact for 1 full second, 2, long enough for something to pass between them that didn't need to be said. "Trust me." Amara held her gaze. Then she picked up the legal pad, folded it under her arm, and walked toward the East Wing without another word. Hye-Rin stood in the kitchen and listened to her footsteps recede. Then she straightened her jacket, checked the small recording device Sarah had fitted into the lining of her left cuff, voice-activated, military-grade, transmitting live to Sarah's system and writing simultaneously to a local backup. And she walked to the formal sitting room and sat down in the chair that faced the door and waited. Tae-wook arrived at 3:42. He came through the front gate with 2 men who remained outside at his instruction, a choice that struck Hye-Rin as either confident or performative, and she couldn't yet determine which. He walked through the entrance hall with the ease of a man who had been in this building many times over many years, which he had. He wore a charcoal suit and no tie, and he looked, Hye-Rin thought, exactly like what he was. A man in his late 50s who had spent 3 decades being trusted by people he was systematically using. He sat across from her without being invited to. "You look tired," he said. "I'm not," she said. He smiled slightly. The smile was a tool, like everything else about him. "Cho tells me you're planning an emergency session." "I'm considering it." "For what purpose?" "Restructuring," Hye-Rin said. "The Eastern operations have been underperforming. I'm looking at the leadership configuration." Tae-wook looked at her steadily. He was running his own read on the rooms. She could see it, the slight quality of attention behind his eyes that wasn't casual, the way his gaze moved just once to the corners of the room and back. He was checking for people. He found nothing that alarmed him, which was because June's team was positioned in places he wouldn't think to look. "I think we both know this isn't about Eastern operations," he said. Hye-Rin said nothing. "I sent you something this week," Tae-wook said. He leaned back slightly, one arm resting on the chair arm, relaxed, managed. "I thought it might give you some clarity about the situation with the young woman." "It gave me clarity," Hye-Rin said. "Good." He paused. "I know this is painful, finding someone who appears to be what you've been looking for. I understand why you wanted to believe it, but the evidence speaks for itself." "The evidence was fabricated," Hye-Rin said. The room changed temperature. Tae-wook's expression did not move. This was itself information. A man who hadn't done what she was accusing him of would have reacted. The stillness was a tell. "That's a serious accusation." The library footage has a corrupted metadata timestamp that places it 16 months ago, when Amara was documented at an Incheon municipal shelter. She was 2 hours away on the date the footage claims to show her. Hye-Rin's voice was level, precise, the way it got when she was delivering something that couldn't be argued with, and she wanted the person across from her to feel the weight of each word landing separately. The audio recording shows compression artifacts consistent with voice synthesis built from scraped samples. And Darius Cole recorded his testimony 2 blocks from the private room above the Busan restaurant you've used for the last 7 years. Tae-wook was very still. "Did you know," Hye-Rin said, "that Cole's encrypted communication with your Shell account goes back 14 months? And that threaded through those records are references to an arrangement made 22 years ago, references to a nurse, a hospital, an Incheon solution, that correspond precisely to the night my daughter was supposed to have died." Silence. Outside, a bird, the refrigerator in the next room, the specific ambient quiet of a large house that is holding its breath. "I want to talk about that night," Hye-Rin said. "I want you to tell me, sitting here, why you did it." Tae-wook moved. Not toward her. Just a shift, a recalibration, his body making a small adjustment the way a structure makes a small adjustment when the load on it changes. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer the managed affability he'd walked in with. It was something older and more stripped down. "You were going to give her everything," he said. "A 6-month-old child, half foreign, illegitimate by every standard your family held. And you were going to hand her the Baek-Crayon succession because you were sentimental about a man who had already left the country." His voice was flat. Not apologetic. Explanatory, which was worse. The syndicate would not have survived a succession like that. The alliances we had built, everything required a Korean heir, a legitimate heir, someone the council could accept. A mixed-race child with an absent American father would have destroyed everything your family built in 30 years. "She was my daughter," Hye-Rin said. "She was a liability," Tae-wook said, "and I made a decision that kept this organization alive." The words went into the room and stayed there. Hye-Rin looked at him. She was breathing. She could feel it, steady, calibrated, every muscle in her chest doing the specific work of keeping something enormous inside its container. "You let me bury an empty casket," she said. "You stood beside me. You held my arm. I did what was necessary." "You found her again," Hye-Rin said. 22 years later. You found her at that university, and you sent Cole to destroy her before she could become anything I might recognize. You tried to ruin her life to protect a secret." Something moved in Tae-wook's jaw. She was getting close to people who knew the old stories. She was asking questions at the orphanage. I had someone there, I knew. It was a precaution. She was asking questions at the orphanage, Hye-Rin said, because she grew up there, and she was looking for any information about where she came from. She wasn't looking for you. She didn't know you existed. Her voice didn't rise. It went the opposite direction, quieter, which in this room, for this man, was far more dangerous. She was just a person trying to understand who she was. And you sent someone to take that apart. Tae-wook's expression hardened. The performative layer was fully gone now. What was underneath it was something Hye-Rin recognized. The specific expression of a man who has decided that the negotiation phase is over. What are you going to do? He said. It wasn't a question. It was a probe. He was reading exits. I already did it, Hye-Rin said. He heard something in that sentence. His eyes moved to the corners again, faster this time, then to her left cuff, then back to her face. Sarah, Hye-Rin said at a normal speaking volume. The door to the sitting room opened, and Sarah walked in with a tablet, turned it to face Tae-wook, and showed him the live transmission indicator, green light, recording timestamp running. Everything from the moment he'd walked through the door, Tae-wook stood up. Sit down, said Jun Park from behind him. Tae-wook turned. Jun was in the doorway he'd come through, with two people behind him whose presence in the room was unambiguous. Tae-wook looked at them. He looked at Hye-Rin. He did the math with the speed of a man who has been doing crisis math for decades, and the number he arrived at was visible on his face. He sat down. The recording, Hye-Rin said, along with the communication records, Mina Ree's formal statement, the financial documentation linking your account to Cole's operations, and the forensic analysis of the fabricated evidence you sent me has already been transmitted to two separate locations. One is my lawyer. One is a contact in the prosecutor's office who has been building a case against syndicate-adjacent fraud for the last 3 years and will find this material extremely relevant. She looked at him without expression. Your men outside have been detained by Jun's team. Darius Cole was picked up in Busan 40 minutes ago. Tae-wook's face had gone to something flat and gray, the color of a face that has run out of moves. There is one thing I want from you before this goes where it's going, Hye-Rin said. I want you to say it. Not for the recording. That's already done. For me. I want to hear you say what you did. The room was very quiet. Tae-wook looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he said, in a voice that had lost all its management, all its architecture, the voice of a man who has been carrying something for 22 years and is now, finally, setting it down whether he wants to or not. I had the child removed. I arranged the false death. I paid the nurse. I had her placed where she wouldn't be found. A pause. She wasn't supposed to survive as well as she did. She wasn't supposed to come back. But she did, Hye-Rin said. He said nothing. She did, Hye-Rin said again, and there was something in the repetition that wasn't triumph. It was heavier than that, the specific weight of 22 years of grief arriving at a place where it finally had somewhere to go. Jun moved forward. It was done. The rest was procedure. But as Jun reached for Tae-wook's arm, the man moved, not toward Hye-Rin, not toward the door, but toward the side table where a decorative letter opener sat in a ceramic holder, a thing so ordinary in this room that nobody had thought to remove it, and in the fraction of a second between its being there and not being there, Tae-wook had it in his hand and was moving not as a man with a weapon, but as a man making a point, making a statement, trying to find a version of this moment that wasn't the one he was in. Jun was fast. He was across the room in 2 strides, and his hand was on Tae-wook's wrist before the object got anywhere useful, and there was a brief, brutal struggle of about 4 seconds. A lamp going over, a chair scraping hard on the floor, someone's elbow finding a corner of the table with a sound that indicated bone, and then Tae-wook was down, not badly hurt but fully controlled, Jun's knee in his back and his wrist at an angle that made further argument physiologically inadvisable. Hye-Rin had not moved from her chair. She watched Tae-wook's cheek pressed against the sitting room floor, the same floor she had walked across 10,000 times in 22 years, the same room where she had held counsel, signed agreements, navigated the entire elaborate machinery of the empire this man had helped her build on top of a grief he had manufactured. and she breathed. "Get him out," she said. They got him out. The room was suddenly very quiet again. The overturned lamp, the moved chair. Sarah stood near the door looking at her tablet. June came back in and straightened his jacket and looked at Hye-Rin with the specific expression of a man who has done many difficult things in service of this woman and is now understanding that this one was different in kind from all the others. "It's done," he said. "Not yet," Hye-Rin said. She stood up. She walked out of the sitting room and down the hall and through the corridor toward the east wing. She could feel the adrenaline leaving her body, the physical aftermath of it, the tremble in her hands she allowed herself now that no one was watching, the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained control over a long period, from holding yourself at a particular pitch for hours, and then suddenly not needing to. She stopped at the sealed door. She stood in front of it. Then she kept walking to the guest room at the end of the wing, where Mrs. Yoon was sitting in a chair outside the door, and stood up immediately when she saw Hye-Rin coming, reading her face with the accuracy of a woman who had been in this house for 15 years and knew every weather pattern it produced. "Is it over?" Mrs. Yoon asked. "Almost," Hye-Rin said. She knocked on the guest room door. Amara opened it. She was holding the legal pad. She had been writing the whole time, Hye-Rin realized, filling pages, building the record of her own life with the same focused attention she brought to everything, because sitting still in a crisis was not something her body knew how to do. She looked at Hye-Rin's face, and she read it the way she had been reading Hye-Rin's face since the kitchen, with a speed and accuracy that felt like something more than learned behavior, like something that had been waiting in her all along for the right context to operate in. "He confessed," Amara said. "On recording," Hye-Rin said. "Everything. The hospital, the nurse, the arrangement, Cole. All of it." Amara stood in the doorway and absorbed this. Her expression moved through several things quickly. Not the explosion of relief Hye-Rin might have expected, but something more complicated, more interior, the expression of a person processing the moment when something that has defined their entire existence, the central structural wound of not being wanted, not being kept, not being real to anyone who should have known them, is revealed to have been a crime, not a verdict. Not the truth about who she was, but a thing that was done to her by a man who was afraid of what she might become. Her exhale was long and unsteady. "What happens now?" she said. "The prosecutor's office takes it from here," Hye-Rin said. "Tae-wook will be formally arrested. Cole is already in custody in Busan. The debt in your name gets unraveled. That will take some weeks, but it will happen. Mina Ree's statement is protected, and she'll be kept safe." She paused. "And we have some things to discuss about what comes next for you, what you want, what you need." She stopped herself from saying more, because she was aware that this was not a moment for plans. This was a moment that needed to be what it was, without being organized into something manageable. Amara looked at her. Then she looked past her, down the corridor, at the sealed door. "I want to see it," she said. "The room." Hye-Rin followed her gaze. 22 years, the deadbolt, the chain, the sealed frame, everything she had put there to keep grief from getting air. She looked at her daughter standing in the doorway of the guest room with a legal pad in her hand and paint-stained canvas bag visible on the bed behind her, and her eyes steady and red-rimmed and waiting. "Okay," Hye-Rin said. They walked the corridor together. Their footsteps on the floor were the only sound. When they reached the door, Hye-Rin stood in front of it and reached into her jacket pocket and found the key that had lived there for 11 years. Not on a keychain, not on a hook, just loose in the pocket of whatever jacket she was wearing because she could not put it somewhere she didn't have access to, even though she had never once used it. She looked at the door. She put the key in the deadbolt. Her hand was not entirely steady. She turned it. The bolt drew back with a sound like something exhaling, and the chain came off, and Hye-Rin put her palm flat on the door and felt the resistance of a frame that had been sealed for over a decade. And she pushed, and the door opened into a room she had not entered since Sora was 6 months old and the world still had warmth in it. And the smell that came out was not decay or emptiness, but something else entirely. Something that had been preserved in the still air of a closed space. Something that had been waiting. Amara stepped up beside her. They stood together in the doorway. And in the room beyond, The small white furniture, the mobile above an empty crib that had never been taken down, the shelf of books arranged with a care that had become, over 22 years, a kind of monument. Something that had been held apart from the rest of the house was finally allowed to be part of it again. Neither of them spoke. Outside, somewhere in the city, Kang Tae-wook was being put in a car. And here, in a room that had been sealed against grief for 2 decades, a woman and her daughter stood at the threshold of everything that had been taken from them. The light through the window was the late afternoon kind, long, low, the color of something that is almost gone, but not yet. Hye-Rin reached out. Amara took her hand, and for a moment, before what came next, they simply stood there and let the room be what it was. They stood in that doorway for a long time. Neither of them moved into the room immediately. It wasn't hesitation exactly, it was something more like respect, the way you pause at the edge of water before stepping in, because you understand that once you do, you will be changed by the temperature, and there is no returning to the moment before you knew what it felt like. The room held its stillness around them. The mobile above the crib turned slightly in the displaced air from the open door. A slow rotation, unhurried, the kind of movement that has no urgency because it has been moving in its own time for 22 years with no one watching. Hye-Rin went in first. Her footsteps on the floor were careful, not from fear, but from the specific care you take in a place that has been held intact. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The same persimmon tree. The frost long gone, but the tree still bare in November's particular way of being bare, stripped down to essential architecture, every branch visible and exact. She had looked out this window when Sora was alive and the world had an orientation she understood. She had not looked out it since. Amara came in behind her and stopped near the bookshelf. She stood in front of it the way she stood in front of all shelves, reading the spines before touching anything, taking inventory. The books were a mixture. Korean picture books, a few English board books with cloth covers, 2 volumes of illustrated folk tales. They had been arranged with the spine facing outward in a specific order that Hye-Rin could not remember establishing but clearly had, alphabetical by color, which was the kind of organizational logic you applied to a baby's shelf before the baby was old enough to have preferences. Amara put 2 fingers on the spine of a cloth book. The same movement, the same light pressure, the spine before the cover, and didn't take it out, just touched it. Hye-Rin watched her from across the room and said nothing. There are moments that don't need language. This was one of them. The room itself was doing the work. 22 years of held time releasing slowly, like pressure through a small valve, and all they needed to do was be present for it. After a while, Amara turned from the shelf. "Tell me about her," she said. "Tell me about the 6 months." Hye-Rin looked at her. The request was so simple and so enormous at the same time. Nobody had asked her this in 22 years. She had not been asked because people understood, or thought they understood, that asking was cruelty. What they didn't understand was that not asking was also a kind of cruelty, the kind that leaves a person alone with something that needs to be shared to be survived. She sat on the edge of the crib. It held her weight. Of course it did. It was built for more than a baby, built with the over-engineered solidity of Korean furniture from that era, built to last. She was loud, Hye-Rin said, from the first week. She had opinions about things she had no basis for having opinions about. She cried with specificity, a different sound for hunger, a different one for overstimulation, a completely separate register for when she wanted to be held, and nobody was moving fast enough. A pause. I learned all of them within the first month. Her father said I was imagining the distinctions. He was wrong. Amara sat down on the floor near the bookshelf, her back against the wall, knees drawn up, listening. She liked mornings, Hye-Rin said. She woke up without escalating. Most babies, I was told, go from asleep to screaming. She woke up and was just awake, alert, looking at things. She stopped. She liked looking at things. She would stare at a patch of light on the wall for 20 minutes. I used to think she was watching something I couldn't see. She stopped again. She was 6 months old when she got sick. By that point, I had stopped sleeping in shifts because she had started sleeping through the night. 3 weeks before she died, Before I thought she died, she had slept 7 hours in a row, and I woke up in a panic because the monitor was quiet. Amara's expression was very still. That was the last normal night, Hye-Rin said. The next week the fever started, and 3 weeks after that, she stopped. Held the stop, let it be what it was. I believed them, she said. I believed the doctors because the alternative was not believable. Because who would do that? Who would take a sick baby and tell a mother she was dead? Her voice did not break. It went somewhere more controlled than breaking. I know now why I should have asked more questions. I know what I should have seen. But I was 29 years old and my daughter was dying, and the people around me were people I trusted, and I was not yet the person I became after. The last sentence landed in the room and settled. The person you became, Amara said carefully. A person who doesn't believe things without proof, Hye-Rin said. A person who does not trust proximity. A person who built walls around everything she cared about, which, after that night, was nothing and no one, which made it easier. She looked at the mobile turning slowly. I thought that was strength. For 22 years, I thought that was survival. She looked at Amara. It was just a very long way of staying in this room with the door closed. The afternoon light shifted slightly. Outside, somewhere in the city, the ordinary machinery of a November day was running without them, indifferent and continuous. Amara said, I used to make up parents. Hye-Rin looked at her. At the orphanage, Amara said. Most kids did. You'd pick someone, a teacher, someone you saw at the market, and you'd build a whole story. Why they gave you up? Why it wasn't because of you? What they looked like, whether they thought about you. She was looking at the floor, her voice even. The story I kept coming back to was a woman, Korean, smart, someone who had to make an impossible choice. She paused. I never made her dangerous. I made her lonely. I made her someone who looked at things she couldn't have and felt it, but didn't show it. A longer pause. I don't know what that means. I probably made her that way because it was the version I could survive believing in. Hye-Rin sat on the crib and looked at her daughter on the floor and thought about what it costs a child to make peace with abandonment by making the person who abandoned them sympathetic. What it takes to do that work alone, at whatever age Amara had first done it. 8, 10, younger maybe. Children start the mathematics of their own wounding very early. You were not abandoned, Hye-Rin said. One more time, because some things need to be said more than once before they become real. I know that now, Amara said. It doesn't immediately undo the years of believing otherwise, but it changes the architecture of it. It changes what the wound is. She looked up. It was always something that was done to both of us. I just didn't know there was a both until now. They sat in the room until the light went fully gold and then began to diminish. And then Mrs. Yoon knocked softly on the open door and said dinner was ready whenever they wanted it, and they both came back from wherever the last hour had taken them and looked at the ordinary fact of a meal being prepared in the kitchen below. And Amara uncurled from the floor with the specific stiffness of someone who has been sitting still longer than they realized, and they walked out of the room together. Hye-Rin did not lock it behind her. She left the door open. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing real is simple once you decide to stop managing it at a distance. Kang Tae-wook was formally arrested 4 days after the confrontation in the sitting room. The charges initially filed as fraud and financial conspiracy, while the prosecutor's office worked through the more complex documentation around the kidnapping. The word used in Mina Ri's statement and in the decrypted communications, clear and unambiguous. Darius Cole was held in Busan and cooperated fully with investigators within 48 hours, which surprised no one who had watched him operate. He was a man who had always cut losses quickly. The question of loyalty had never been structurally relevant to him. The inner council of the Baekrian syndicate convened an emergency session without Tae-wook's seat occupied. Hye-Rin chaired it. She disclosed what she needed to disclose and withheld what was private, and the council did what councils do when power shifts irrevocably. They recalibrated, some with grace, a few with visible reluctance that she filed away for later attention. The restructuring of the Eastern operations, which had been the ostensible reason for the emergency session that had never actually been called, was real enough as an operational matter, and was handled with the efficiency of people who understood that the alternative to efficient adaptation was irrelevance. Cho Byung-soo's brother's debt was cleared. The documentation was handled by Hye-Rin's lawyer in a single afternoon, and the transfer was clean and untraceable in the way that all her financial moves were. Cho submitted a formal resignation from the Northern Logistics Division 2 weeks later. Hye-Rin accepted it without ceremony and without prejudice, and put a recommendation for him in the file that would help him find work in an adjacent industry if he wanted it. She did not know if he would use it. She thought he probably would. People generally wanted to work. It was one of the more reliable things about them. Mina Ri remained in Incheon. Hye-Rin arranged additional security for her apartment building through a third party. Not dramatically, not with visible guards that would alarm the old woman or her neighbors, just the quiet presence of reliable people on the street below. She called Mina once, 2 weeks after the arrest, and the call lasted 4 minutes. She thanked her for not killing her daughter when she was ordered to. The sentence took a long time to say, and it didn't get easier with preparation. Mina said she was sorry it had taken this long. Hye-Rin said she was too. They hung up. It was not a clean resolution. It couldn't be, given what Mina had done and left undone. But it was an honest one, and honest was what was available. Amara's debt was unwound over the course of 6 weeks. The process required a lawyer who specialized in fraud-adjacent financial instruments, and it required documentation from Cole's formal cooperation with investigators, and it required Amara to sit in 2 separate meetings with officials whose manner suggested they found the whole affair tedious, which Amara handled with a composure that impressed even Hye-Rin. She sat in those rooms and answered questions in a voice that was clear and undefensive, and gave exactly what was asked without giving more. And when it was over, she walked out without looking back, which was, Hye-Rin was learning, very much her manner of moving through the world. What was harder to unwind was everything else. The night terrors started in the 3rd week, Amara waking at 2 or 3 in the morning with the specific disorientation of a person whose body had been on high alert for so long that it didn't know what to do with safety, and interpreted the unfamiliar silence of the Baekryong estate as a different kind of threat. Hye-Rin heard her the first time, moving in the guest room down the hall, and got up and stood outside the door and listened, not intruding, trying to read from the sound of movement whether this was something that needed company or space. She stood there for 5 minutes. Then Amara's door opened, and they looked at each other in the corridor at 3 in the morning, both of them in the particular state of people who have been awake in the dark for a while. And Amara said, "I don't need anything. I just needed to move." "I know," Hye-Rin said. They went to the kitchen, and Hye-Rin made tea that was too strong. And Amara drank it anyway, because she'd never been precious about tea, and they sat at the table in the 3 in the morning quiet that is different from all other quiets, less demanding, more forgiving. And Amara said, "How long did it take you?" "After. To sleep normally." Hye-Rin thought about it honestly. "I don't know that I ever did. I reorganized around it. You learn to function on less than you need, and you call that normal." A pause. "That's not advice. That's just what I did. You can probably do better." "You did the best you could," Amara said, "with what you had." Hye-Rin looked at her. "So did you." The tea cooled between them. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was dark and very still. "I want to go back to school," Amara said. "I know that might seem—" "It doesn't seem anything," Hye-Rin said. "Tell me what you need." "I need to do it myself," Amara said. "I need to apply again, go through the process, do the coursework. I can't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't want the thing I'm building to have been handed to me. I know that might not make sense when we're sitting in your house, and you've already—" "It makes complete sense," Hye-Rin said. Amara looked at her. "You're not going to argue about it?" "Why would I argue about it?" Hye-Rin set down her cup. "You're 22 years old, and you know what you want, and you know how you want to get there. My job is not to override that. My job is to make sure the ground under you is solid enough that you can do the work without falling through it." A pause. "That's all I wanted for you when you were 6 months old, and I didn't get to want it for long enough. I'm not going to make up for that by taking over now." Amara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're different than I thought you'd be." "How did you think I would be?" "Harder," Amara said. "I knew who you were. After the restaurant, before the DNA results. I looked you up, read what there was to read. You have a reputation that is," she paused, choosing carefully, "significant." "The reputation is accurate," Hye-Rin said. "I know," Amara said. "That's what I mean. The reputation is accurate, and you're also this. Both things are real. I didn't expect that to be possible." Hye-Rin looked at her. "People are always more than one thing. That's not a comfort. Sometimes it's the opposite." She picked up her cup again. "I have done things that deserve the reputation. I'm not going to rewrite that because I found you. But I can. I can be different in here, in this house, with you." She stopped. "I want to be." Amara nodded. Small, slow, the nod of someone adding something to a structure they're building internally. They sat in the kitchen until 4:30, when the darkness outside began its first tentative negotiation with morning, and then they both went back to bed. And Hye-Rin slept for 3 hours without interruption, which was more than she usually managed. In December, Amara moved into the East Wing properly. Not the guest room, a room 2 doors down that had better light in the mornings, and a window seat she had independently identified as the best reading position in the building. She brought the canvas bag. She also brought, from a second-hand bookshop in Seo that she had visited on her own on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 paperbacks she stacked on the windowsill. The room took on her specific character within 48 hours. The books, a notepad on the desk, a sweater on the back of the chair that she never seemed to hang up, a mug on the windowsill that she refilled and forgot and refilled again. Hye-Rin noticed all of it and said nothing about any of it, which was its own kind of language. The university application went in on a Thursday in mid-December. Amara had worked on the personal statement for 2 weeks, writing and discarding and rewriting with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She showed Hye-Rin the final version once, not asking for edits, just asking her to read it. Hye-Rin read it in the study while Amara sat across from her and looked at the garden. And it was the most honest document Hye-Rin had read in decades. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. It described what had happened to Amara in plain language that didn't ask for pity and didn't perform resilience. It said what books had done for her at an age when nothing else was doing anything. It said what she wanted to do with that and why. It was the statement of a person who had thought seriously about what they owed the world and had arrived at a number they intended to pay. Hye-Rin set it down. "Don't change anything," she said. The formal charges against Kang Tae-wook were expanded in January to include kidnapping and conspiracy to commit homicide, the latter tied to the original instruction he had given Mina Ri, documented in the decrypted communications with enough specificity to constitute evidence. His legal team was formidable and well-funded, and the case would take time. Hye-Rin had understood this from the beginning. She had not gone into this expecting a fast conclusion. She had gone into it expecting a thorough one, and thorough was what she had built. She attended one meeting with the prosecutor's team in January at their offices in a building downtown whose hallways smelled of printer paper and cold coffee. She sat across from a woman 10 years her junior who had the manner of someone who had been underestimated her entire career and had long since stopped being surprised by it. And they spoke for 2 hours with the specific candor of people who are on the same side of something and both know it and neither needs to perform it. The prosecutor said the case was strong. She said the communications records were the backbone. She said Mina Ri's statement was credible and her willingness to testify in person, if it came to that, would be decisive. Hye-Rin said, "It will come to that. Tae-wook will not plead." "Men like him rarely do," the prosecutor said. "They believe they can still control the room." "He can't," Hye-Rin said. "Not this one." She drove back to the estate in the afternoon with the city moving around her car the way it always did, indifferent and continuous and alive. She drove through the gate and up the drive and saw the light on in the room with the window seat in the East Wing, which meant Amara was home and reading, and something settled in Hye-Rin's chest at the sight of it. Not the dramatic arrival of peace, nothing so clean as that, just the small, reliable warmth of a window being lit because someone was in the room behind it. She had not known, until recently, how much she had missed having a lit window to come home to. In February, Amara received her acceptance to the Education Studies program at Seoul National University. The letter was electronic and arrived at 8:43 in the morning, and she brought her laptop to the kitchen and turned it to face Hye-Rin without saying anything and watched her read it. And when Hye-Rin looked up, Amara was smiling. Not the performed, careful version of a smile that she had worn in the restaurant that first night, the smile that was managing something, but the real version, the one that had nowhere to hide because she wasn't trying to hide anything. Hye-Rin looked at that smile for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Amara's and held it there. No speech, no declaration, just the weight of her hand and the fact of this morning. Amara turned her hand over and held it back. Spring came the way spring comes after a hard winter, not gently, not as a reward for endurance, but with the specific bluntness of a season that arrives because it is time, regardless of whether you are ready. The persimmon tree in the garden began its particular preparations in March. By April, the first small leaves had come, the tentative kind, the ones that test the air before committing. Mrs. Yoon planted things in the kitchen garden that she had not planted in several years, because the house had not felt, she told Amara in the frank way she had of saying things, like a house that needed a kitchen garden for a while. Amara started her coursework in March. The university was a subway ride and a bus away, and she took both, every day, in the ordinary way of a person who is doing an ordinary thing. She had a student ID with her photograph on it, and a schedule in a bag that was new. Not the canvas one, which she had kept but which lived in her room now on the shelf beside the cloth book she had finally taken down and read, cover to cover, in one sitting the week she moved in properly. She had classmates who didn't know who her mother was, which was how she wanted it, and she was learning that being anonymous was not the same as being alone. She came home in the evenings, and sometimes she told Hye-Rin about the day, and sometimes she didn't, and both were acceptable, and the gradual calibration of what to share and what to hold was the work of two people learning the grammar of a relationship that had no existing template, not mother and daughter in any conventional sense, not friends exactly, not the abstracted idea of family that Amar had grown up being told she didn't have access to. Something specific to them, something being built from what they had, which was imperfect material assembled under difficult conditions, which made it, paradoxically, more durable than anything built easily. There was a Saturday in April, warm enough to sit outside for the first time that year, when Hye-Rin came out to the garden and found Amara on the bench near the persimmon tree, with her coursework spread around her and a pen behind her ear and her shoes off, her bare feet on the stone. She was reading something with enough focus that she didn't hear Hye-Rin come out, and Hye-Rin stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her, the same way she had watched her that first week, through the kitchen window, the girl in the garden who was reading a book she'd held by the spine before opening it. Only now the garden was hers. Now the house was hers. Now the window that Hye-Rin looked through was a window in a home, rather than a window in a monument to grief. Hye-Rin brought 2 cups of tea out and set one on the bench beside Amara, who looked up and reached for it without breaking the paragraph she was reading, which was the kind of thing you did when you were comfortable enough with a person that you didn't need to interrupt yourself to acknowledge them. And Hye-Rin sat in the other chair and drank her tea and looked at the persimmon tree and let the morning be what it was. This chapter is about how children form attachment models before they have language for them, Amara said without looking up. How early experience shapes what they expect from relationships, whether they expect them to be safe. And, Hye-Rin said, and the research says it's not fixed, Amara said. Early patterns can be revised. It takes longer when the original pattern was disrupted, but it's possible. She turned a page. I think I'm reading a lot of developmental psychology for reasons that are not entirely academic. Probably, Hye-Rin said. Are you reading anything? Amara asked. I'm trying, Hye-Rin said. I keep getting distracted. By what? Hye-Rin looked at the garden, at the new leaves on the tree, at the kitchen garden along the far wall where Mrs. Yoon had staked the first shoots of something green and certain, at the morning light on all of it, exact and unhurried, the kind of light that doesn't try to be anything except what it is. By this, she said. Amara looked up from the book. She looked at Hye-Rin, and then at the garden, and then at the house behind them. The open door, the lit kitchen, the east wing window with the mug still on the sill from the morning. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone who has spent a long time knowing what it was to have nothing in particular to come back to, and is now in the process of learning, slowly, that this is what it feels like when that changes. She looked back at her book, but she was smiling. In May, Kang Tae-wook went to trial. The proceedings were not public in the way that some trials are public. There were elements the prosecutor kept from general circulation, operational details that intersected with ongoing cases that couldn't be aired. What was public was enough. The kidnapping charge, the conspiracy, the documented instruction to a hospital nurse, the 22-year concealment sustained through a sustained campaign of proximity and manufactured trust. Tae-wook sat in the courtroom with the bearing of a man who had decided that bearing was the last thing he controlled, and he kept it throughout. His legal team was competent and argued hard, but the communications records were what the prosecutor had said they were, a backbone. And Mina Rhee testified in person with the voice of a woman who had been waiting for this particular room for a very long time. And what she said in that room was clear and unrepeatable, and it made 3 jurors cry and a 4th cover their mouth, which was not a thing that happened often in a courtroom of that type. Hye-Rin was present for the verdict. She sat in a row behind the prosecution team, and she was dressed the way she was always dressed, precisely, without redundancy. And she held her hands in her lap and listened to the charges being read and answered one by one, and her face was entirely composed, which was not because she wasn't feeling anything. It was because she had been feeling everything for 22 years and had learned to let it move through her without taking the surface down with it. Guilty. Guilty. Guilty on the 3rd count with deliberation. The room moved around her. The prosecutor's team made the quiet movements of people who have won something they worked hard for. Tae-wook's team was still. Tae-wook himself looked straight ahead, at a fixed point on the wall, and Hye-Rin looked at him. Looking at that point and thought about all the things she had believed about him over 30 years, all the trust she had organized her operation around, all the time she had read a room correctly except for the man in it who was most dangerous. She did not feel triumph. She felt the specific, heavy release of something coming to an end. Not the grief. The grief was not over and would not be over, because grief for what was lost doesn't conclude just because the person responsible for the loss has been named and sentenced. It becomes something else. It becomes part of the sediment of a life, part of what the land is made of, and you build on top of it differently than you build on solid ground, but you build. Amara was not in the courtroom. She had said, quietly, in early April, that she didn't want to be there for the verdict. She said she had already received what she needed from the truth. She didn't need to watch it be formalized by a room full of strangers. Hye-Rin had understood this completely. She drove home from the courthouse alone. She walked through the gate, up the drive, through the front door. Mrs. Yoon was in the kitchen. The house smelled of something cooking. The light in the east wing was on. She walked to the east corridor. Amar's door was open. She was sitting at the desk with her coursework, a pen in her hand, and she looked up when Hye-Rin appeared in the doorway. She read Hye-Rin's face in the way she had been reading it since the beginning, accurately, quickly, without needing it explained. Guilty, Amara said. All counts, Hye-Rin said. Amara held her gaze for a moment. Then she set the pen down and turned her chair slightly to face the room rather than the desk. She looked like what she was. A young woman in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, doing coursework, with a mug on the windowsill and a sweater on the back of her chair, and books stacked on the sill beside the cloth one she'd read the first week. She looked like someone who had made a life out of the materials available to her, which had been scant, and had made it anyway, and was now in the process of making a different kind. Are you okay? She asked. Hye-Rin stood in the doorway. She thought about the question honestly. She thought about what okay meant when the thing you'd been working toward for months was finished, and the grief it had been organized around was still there underneath, older than the work, older than the walls she'd built. As old as a night in November 22 years ago when a nurse made a choice in a hospital corridor that sent a child 2 hours south and a mother 22 years sideways. I think so, she said. Not because it fixed anything, but because it's done. Amara nodded. "Sit down," she said. "Mrs. Yoon made something that smells like it took the whole day." Hye-Rin came in and sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the May light was doing what May light does in Seoul, long and gold, and more generous than any of the months that came before it. The persimmon tree was fully leafed now, substantial and green, its earlier bare architecture hidden inside something living. They sat in the room together and said nothing for a while, which required no management because there was nothing to manage. The house was quiet around them in the way that houses are quiet when they are actually homes. Not the imposed quiet of a place holding grief at bay, but the ambient quiet of a place where people live and eat and sleep and occasionally don't need to fill the air with anything. After a while, Amara picked up her pen and went back to the page she was on. Hye-Rin looked out the window at the tree. The girl who had walked into a restaurant soaked through and asked for food was a woman now, sitting at a desk in a house she lived in, studying to teach children who would be written off early by people who didn't know what they were worth. She would reach some of them. She would not reach all of them. Nobody reaches all of them, and the ones who say they do are lying or haven't taught long enough to know the difference. But she would reach some, and those some would carry something forward that they would not have carried otherwise, and this was not a small thing. This was, in fact, the only kind of thing that lasted. Hye-Rin had spent 22 years building something she thought would last. Leverage, structure, control, a syndicate that feared her name. And all of that was real, and all of it had cost what it cost, and she was not going to pretend it hadn't been necessary or that she hadn't chosen it with full awareness of the cost. But sitting in a chair by a window in May, watching her daughter work, she understood with a clarity that required no explanation that this, the specific weight of this room, this light, this ordinary Tuesday, was the thing she would carry when everything else was done. The girl who once begged for leftovers in the wrong restaurant on a cold night in October was not someone society had forgotten. She was someone a specific man had tried to make forgettable for 22 years, with every tool available to him, and she had survived it not because she was exceptional, but because she was stubborn, and she loved books, and she kept her chin slightly up even when there was no particular reason to. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was just that nobody had told her. Hye-Rin picked up the mug from the windowsill, Amara's mug, still half full from the morning, and held it in both hands the way she held things she was making sure were real. The warmth of it had gone. She held it anyway. Outside, the persimmon tree moved slightly in a wind she couldn't feel from where she sat. Inside, the house breathed around them, and the locked room at the end of the east corridor stood open, as it would from now on, letting in whatever light there was.